So the event has started. We are live on Facebook as well. So welcome everyone. I would just like to introduce the Deputy Chief of Mission, Mr. Eric Meyer, who is going to introduce our speaker tonight. Eric.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Eric Meyer. I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission here at the U.S. Embassy in Skopje. And this evening, and for United Nations World Philosophy Day, we have a very special guest joining us live from Los Angeles, California, renowned philosopher Steven Friedman. Steven is not new to our audiences here in North Macedonia. He was here over the summer speaking at our American spaces. He performed his play here, was written up in a newspaper article as well. And we're really grateful to him for taking the time today to speak to us on World Philosophy Day. He was recognized by the New York Times as a genius philosopher. So Steven, I want to thank you on behalf of the U.S. Embassy for speaking with us this evening. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that kind introduction. I also want to thank everyone that was involved in making this event possible. Vesna, Nadica, Monica, the entire staff of the U.S. Embassy in Skopje. It is a privilege. It is a privilege for me, and I think for our audience, that this platform is being provided and this event is being recognized. As Eric noted, I was in North Macedonia over the summer. I had a wonderful experience there, and it is again a privilege for me to be rejoining the people of North Macedonia, at least virtually. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, and again, grateful for the platform that the U.S. Embassy and everybody involved in setting this up is providing. Well, it's World Philosophy Day. The first and most important question to address that I will be dealing with in the course of this talk is what philosophy is. Turns out that in general, the nature of philosophy does not seem to be well understood, well appreciated, not just by the general public, but even within academic departments, even I find within departments of philosophy, that the part of the challenge of philosophy is to come to terms with what its actual endeavor consists of. There's the famous admonition of the Delphic oracle of ancient Greece: know thyself, know yourself. Well, that applies to the subject of philosophy as well. Philosophy, in order to appreciate its place, its powers, its potential, we want to come to terms with what it actually is. And to sort of introduce that, a few years ago, a trip was planned for me to Central Asia, where I was going to give some talks and performances. It turns out the pandemic intervened, and I wasn't able to go on that excursion. But in preparation for it, I went to a local college to see if I could arrange to give some talks to their classes in philosophy, just to practice what I was going to be doing, because as is characteristic of my talks, they're not scripted in advance. I find that when something is scripted, it goes dead in the delivery. So I wanted to be able to practice a little bit in advance of the trip. I went and met with a couple of professors of philosophy, including the department chair. As I was walking to the building where the philosophy department is housed, I noted that it was in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences building. So I went and I spoke to these two professors, and I told them, it's curious that that you have philosophy connected with humanities and social sciences, when in fact, philosophy is not a humanities, it's not a social science, it's not a physical science. And the department chairperson asked me then, what is philosophy? And I said, quite simply, philosophy is the limit of rigor. Now, part of this talk will be devoted to explaining exactly what that means. But to summarize it, to introduce the concept, philosophy has nothing whatsoever to do with belief, opinion, theory, faith, assumption. Its only concern is with the incontrovertible, incontestable, what cannot possibly be denied, what is certain beyond all possible doubt. Those descriptions, those words characterize the limit of rigor. Rigor is a word that has a lot of currency these days. It's probably the single most important concept within the sciences, all the sciences, the physical sciences, the social sciences, the biomedical sciences. If a study, an investigation, an experiment is not rigorously conceived and designed and executed, its results do not bind us. Effectively, a non-rigorous study proves nothing at all. So science is always aiming for rigor, something that compels us to accept its results. Now, as we're going to see, nothing within the sciences rises to the highest level of rigor. The studies that are touted as rigorous are actually only approximately so, not really so. The domain of rigor is the domain of philosophy, purely and simply. And one of the things that we're going to explore is what that is and what the power of that concept is. Now, probably the most important thing about the limit of rigor is, given its incontestability, there is in principle nothing stronger. There is nothing in principle more powerful. The power of rigor, as philosophy embraces and exercises it, was sufficient to create the sciences, to create the philosophical method, the scientific method, and more than that, to be able to evaluate it, criticize it, and modify it. Philosophy has the ability to stand in criticism, in evaluation of every other human activity because of its privileged position at the limit of rigor. Now, in terms of some of the practical results that that's given rise to, well, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, Steven Weinberg, once said, at the highest level, physics becomes philosophy. Einstein and Heisenberg in relativity and quantum mechanics were actually elaborating the physics of existentialism. They were guided by philosophical intuition. And the physics of existentialism is the physics of the circumstance, that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, experience it from the outside. The solution to the world and to our issues and our problems must be found here and now, and grounded in something that is incontestable if it's going to satisfy our deepest needs, and if it's going to stand up against all possible opposition. It's often said that philosophy stimulates debate and discussion. That's not its ultimate ambition. The ultimate ambition of philosophy, of rigor, is to end debate, end discussion, and position us in a ground of incontrovertible safety, security, the ground of rigor. There's a, when I was in college, when I was an undergraduate, a book was published on the films of Ingmar Bergman, the celebrated Swedish director. The title of the book, The Silence of God. Turns out if you believe in a God, in a deity, the surest path to an understanding of the nature of deity is rigor itself. And rigor, philosophy establishes, inhabits, justifies the silence of God. Okay, so that's just a little bit, some of those ideas will become more clear as I develop them. One of the points I think that you'll see is, I'll be talking a little bit about religion in relation to philosophy, science in relation to philosophy. It turns out that both religion and science have more in common with each other, which is why they're often in conflict, than philosophy has with either one. We talk about believing in science or scientific results, believing in religious elaborations. We do not talk about believing in rigor. It's not an option. Rigor compels us, and it compels us not as a prison, doesn't confine us within narrow walls. What it does is it guides us unfailingly, infallibly, towards the ultimate ground of reality, which is what rigor, and only rigor, at its limit, can establish. Now, in the description of this talk, there was a reference to technology and Steve Jobs. So I want to sort of frame that a little bit. When we think about great technological achievements in human history, one stands out as preeminent, partly because of its anticipation, partly because of the dreams that it evoked. It can be argued, I think, fairly compellingly, that the single greatest technological achievement in human history was the moon landing. It was something that, for most of human history, wasn't even seen as conceivable, but it was achieved. And it was achieved as the result of a convergence, a confluence of lots of technologies. So it didn't just represent the mastery of flight or of rocketry, but computer science was essential for the success of that mission. So much of 20th century technology made that result possible. So it represents in human history an acme of technological achievement. I was alive for the moon landing. I remember it. I think it drew the largest worldwide audience of any event in history up till that time. It obviously captivated the world, and for good reason. It was an achievement almost, again, beyond imagining. But what's interesting is, as anticipated and as compelling as that event was, public interest rapidly dropped off. Within a few years, people weren't even watching moon launches. Moon launches weren't even being, or landings weren't even being covered in the media, to the degree that it's now been over 50 years since we went to the moon. You would think if technology can transform our lives decisively, there's the example to point to. Certainly, even in terms of inspiration. Why was there no follow-up? Why didn't we continue to develop from that achievement? Why didn't we colonize the moon? or at least make more of it than we did, rather than just forget about it, almost as if it never happened? And the answer is a profound one. It didn't save us. And by saving us, I'm using that word, it's a religious term, saving us, salvation. I'm using it metaphorically. What I mean by that concept is that which has the power to resolve the problems of human life here and now, and independent of all possible future experience. In other words, I'm using it in the extremity of a religious sense, but I'm not embracing whatever the surrounding sort of beliefs or concepts of that notion are. I'm just using it as a description of something that has the power to resolve all human problems in a similar sense to that in which Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher, was interested in achieving philosophical results that solved all philosophical problems. Salvation goes further. We want to solve everything, here and now, if at all possible. Because of the inability of technology to do that, because of the inability of the moon mission to do that, or to have that kind of dramatic effect on our lives, on our consciousness, on our perception, Steve Jobs was able to utter that famous comment of his, "I would trade all my technology for an afternoon with Socrates." Well, Jobs was seeking a mode of salvation, a complete solution that he knew technology could not provide. But he thought that maybe Socrates had an answer. Socrates stands at the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. And to understand the essence of Socrates' insight that Jobs would like to have been introduced to deeply, it's helpful, I think, to contrast what Socrates achieved with an immediate predecessor of Socrates, a pre-Socratic philosopher before Socrates, Thales. Thales is a name associated with perhaps the first significant philosophical joke. Jokes can play an important role in philosophy. Wittgenstein had commented at one point that an entire work of philosophy, a major work of philosophy, could be written entirely in jokes. The Thales joke helps illuminate the nature of religion and its contrast with philosophy. And it goes like this. Thales would go around proclaiming to people, life is no different than death. To which people would respond, then why don't you die? And Thales' answer, because it makes no difference. Now, it's a joke, but it's actually the relationship that Michelangelo, the great Renaissance artist, sculptor, painter, architect, had towards death. Michelangelo was a Neoplatonist. He was a Christian, but also combined an understanding or an embrace of certain philosophical impulses. Michelangelo's consolation in the face of considerations of death was, if God created this world in all its beauty, then whatever death is, having been created also by the hand of God, can be no less beautiful. So that equivalence, life and death, is something that's actually characteristic within a lot of religious traditions. In Buddhism, not in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God of Hindu culture, we hear, realize that pleasure and pain gain and loss, victory and defeat are one and the same. There's a tendency to establish or posit or propose equivalences between things that otherwise seem distinct. Socrates, but of course, the problem is we can't establish incontrovertibly that equivalence. We don't know. So that kind of position, that kind of embrace doesn't rise to the level of rigor, of philosophical satisfaction. It doesn't meet the demands of philosophy for something incontrovertible. What did Socrates offer that Jobs was so interested in attending to? The most important statement of Socratic understanding is offered by Plato, a student of Socrates, at the end of Plato's first dialogue, the Apology, in which Plato details the circumstances of Socrates' trial by an Athenian court for having corrupted the youth of Athens with his teachings that challenged the authority of the gods. Socrates, in the course of that trial, is fairly imperious, mocking of the proceedings. He was condemned to death. At the end of the Apology, he bids farewell to his friends in words that mark the beginning of Western philosophy, if one wants to point to a few sentences that so distill its essence. Socrates said to his friends, "And so we go our separate ways, you to live and I to die. And which is better? Only God knows. But we think we know, desperately, presumptively, every moment of our suffocating lives, and suffer." Philosophy frees us from presumptions that turn out to be the ground and ultimate source of our suffering in every possible direction. A way to summarize that in an aphorism. I write philosophical aphorisms. They're just concentrated statements. My writings consist of about 20,000 of such aphorisms addressing virtually every aspect of philosophy and its concerns. A summary of what the implications of what Socrates was saying is, we suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. Unjustifiably in the light of the strongest possible rigor. And it is that rigor that countervails those presumptions, that frees us from a prison of really our own mental elaboration. The importance, obviously, is that if we want to free ourselves from illegitimate claims, I've written another aphorism early on, bit by bit, brick by brick, we dismantle the kingdoms of illusion. What are the kingdoms of illusion? Anything that cannot stand the tests of the strongest rigor. Now, to explain a little bit more about what rigor actually is, what philosophic rigor or rigor at its limit amounts to, what its power is, what its significance is, and how the sciences fall short of that kind of achievement. Let me talk a little bit about controlled experimentation. The controlled experiment is central to scientific endeavor, central to the establishing of scientific results that we can embrace. In a controlled experiment, we take two identical things, do one thing to one, a different thing to the other, see what happens. Give one person with cancer a sugar pill, another a new drug, and see if the person given the drug lives longer, does better. But the two people in our study have to be identical, except for the experimental variable, it's called, whether we're giving the person the drug or a placebo. Any difference, even in height, between these two individuals could be responsible for the difference in outcome and not the drug. We try identical twins. Even they are not identical, do not rise to the demands of a rigorous experimental design. Well, let's do a thought experiment. Let's make them identical. Let's imagine 2 points, 2 mathematical points, no properties. And let's imagine them the only 2 things in all the world. Now, let's set up our experiment. One gets the drug, the other a sugar pill, and we see what happens. Under those conditions, can we conclude that a drug was responsible for a difference in outcome? And the answer is no, because one point is to the left of the other. And that difference could be the decisive difference, what's called a confounding variable, that makes it impossible to draw a rigorous conclusion. Turns out that whatever allows us to say that we have 2 points or 2 objects or 2 people and not one is the confounding variable, is the difference that could account for any difference in the outcome within the experimental observations. That's true for any type of controlled experiment. A controlled experiment cannot rise to the level of rigor because of the difference that we cannot eliminate and still have 2 things. It turns out, if we could do a perfectly controlled experiment, nothing could exist, because the condition of existence as the condition of rigor is difference. Now, I've mentioned Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein liked to begin his books, of which there are many, with quotations of people he admired or ideas that express something significant. His great work that was published posthumously is called The Philosophical Investigations. It begins with a quotation from an Austrian playwright, Nestroy. The quotation goes, "It is in the nature of every advance that it appears much greater than it actually is." It's a statement of humility. But what Wittgenstein had considered using was a line from Shakespeare, from King Lear, from the king's counselor Kent, who says, "I'll teach you differences." Now, Wittgenstein's thought perhaps hadn't quite distilled itself to the point where he could fully embrace that admonition, but we can, because that is the essence of the concept of rigor, that whatever difference between if there's any difference between any 2 things, that difference means that what applies to one need not rigorously apply to the other. And it turns out that that condition of difference, of distinctiveness, is what characterizes philosophic space, and what ultimately is the foundation of human dignity, human distinctiveness, and what religions have called salvation. I generalize these notions a little bit. I introduce a term, epistemic. It's something actually that is in use in philosophy, but when I started using it some decades ago, it was not in use. I couldn't find it online. I wanted a term that gave the essence, the nature of the philosophical results that I was elaborating. And I spoke of epistemic space and its characteristics. An epistemic space is another term for a rigorous space, a space that does not fall short of the limits of rigor. And what's characteristic of that space, and it can be described in a lot of different ways, it is a space in which each point is distinguishable and distinct from every other point, if only by position. It is a space that is aconceptual. We cannot formulate concepts within this space, and I will show you why. The best way to think of an epistemic space, to visualize it, is just like this. Each point is distinct, has a distinct position. Concepts cluster points, cluster objects based upon approximate similarities. Concepts achieve this kind of result. We were grouping things together. The term I give for a non-philosophic, non-rigorous, non-epistemic space is heuristic space. The most important features of each, and I can talk about this mathematically, but in lots of different ways too. In epistemic space, points diverge, they are distinct. In heuristic space, points, objects converge, come together. It turns out that the nature of conceptualization, of concept formation, is just such convergence. In heuristic space, the space of language, the space in which we talk about chairs and tables, objects, entities are approximately the same for some purpose or other, some purpose that can serve our interests, some purpose that can help facilitate our survival. Within epistemic space is a divergent space. Every point is distinct. Every point is irreplaceable relative to any other point. So we can see how that establishes the dignity of the individual. We exist in difference from everything else. So an epistemic space, a philosophic space, a divergent space is also an existential space. If there were no difference between us and something else, we would merge and become one, not two. Within heuristic space, the space of language, the space of society, the space of our creative endeavors, any two objects are approximately the same, but rigorously distinct. Because they are rigorously distinct, whatever applies to one does not rigorously apply to another, including concepts like, well, the Buddhist triad, disease, old age, and death. Rigorously, in this world, you know heuristically you're going to die because of your approximate similarities to human beings that have come before. But philosophically, rigorously, you can't make that claim. And so you are freed from it. And the simple fact of the matter is, whether you embrace science or embrace deity or embrace philosophical rigorous truth, you can't know that you will die, right? You can't know that the future will resemble the past. If you embrace the rigor of our circumstances, any difference between past and present frees us from the constraints of what we thought might apply to the past. If you believe in science, science is just generalizing from past experience. It can't make an absolute claim that that experience will continue as it has. If you believe in a deity, well, the deity certainly has the power to decide that the course of events will proceed radically differently than we have imagined. Some of this is summarized in another pair of aphorisms. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. That's a comment on actually the nature of concepts, how our concepts work. And to illustrate that second relationship, the future decides the past, and it's useful to just look quickly at that question: is life real or dream? One of another pervasive philosophical question that seems to assert itself, repeatedly. Well, if we were to wake up one day to a radically different set of circumstances that persisted, then we would decide that this was dream. If the future takes a radically different course than it does, it can undermine anything that we thought we knew about the past. And if you think that something in the past or in our representation of the past is absolutely fixed, absolutely inviolable, absolutely unchangeable, you're simply not imagining a sufficiently radical divergence in direction that the future might take. Nothing can guarantee that. Rigor has no problem with that, because any difference means that the concepts that apply to one will not necessarily apply to the other. So rigor becomes an avenue of freedom. There's a famous comment that the 20th century philosopher JeanPaul Sartre made about World War II. He said, "We were most free during the occupation, during the German occupation. We were free of the past." Rigor, philosophy, has the ability so to free us. Now, one thing I think that's useful to come to terms with is, how do we experience this epistemic space? Is it real? Is it an imagining? Well, being a space that represents the limit of rigor, it's actually the only reality, the ultimate reality. But we're not seeing it, because what we're seeing is our conceptualizations generalized from the past into the present with anticipation of the future. And what I mean by that is, or the best way to imagine the experience of the epistemic. Well, first of all, an epistemic space is actually, here's a little summary too. This is a mathematical formulation of everything I'm saying, a summary. H stands for heuristic, E stands for epistemic. A heuristic space has an identity relationship. Something can be equal to something else. In epistemic space, there's no identity at all. Every point at every moment is distinct. So, the experience of the epistemic is actually what we would see if we were encountering the world for the very first time, but not with the mind of a child that isn't capable of processing, but with the mind that we currently have, but without any experience prior. That experience of what would strike us immediately is the epistemic. Its characteristics are strangeness, novelty, and beauty. The imprint of the epistemic, though, is much more obvious in our experience. If you look around, the thing that you notice at a level of generality, and let me make a comment about that. There's an early 20th century philosopher, Alfred Whitehead, that wrote a book, Science in the Modern World. It was actually the first book I read in philosophy. I read it by accident. I was 12. I was studying science. I thought it was a book about science. It's not. It's a book about philosophy. And early on, Whitehead makes a comment. What matters most decisively, what's most important to us, are circumstances of such great generality that no one ever sees them, because they are always right in front of our eyes. Well, it turns out, if you look around, what do you see at that level of generality? That, in fact, turns out to be decisive in the way that Whitehead was intimating. Quite simply, the world is different in different directions. That asymmetry, that distinctiveness in different directions is the imprint of the epistemic. And it is that distinctiveness in different directions that in and of itself makes controlled experiments theoretically impossible. Because putting an object here versus putting an object here creates, aside from the fact that they're two different things, they're in different surrounds. Their grounds, their environments are different. And from the standpoint of rigor, at the limit of rigor, where our lives and our problems ultimately resolve, even small differences make a major difference. Every difference is decisive from the standpoint of a limiting rigor.
Excuse me,
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but unfortunately, we are at 8:13 in the evening, and we have to,
Oh my God.
Leave some time for questions. Because
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't know time. Okay, so let me finish with just something that's an introduction to one of my books, and it goes like this, and it summarizes some of what I've been saying. It's by a professor at Harvard, Robert Nozick, a celebrated professor. And it goes, Robert Nozick once gave a lecture on the language of philosophy, not its technical vocabulary, or worse, its scholastic excursions, but the diction of its aspirations. He spoke of its characteristically violent imagery, of the force with which it sought to drive home results. He didn't mention Nietzsche's will to philosophize with a hammer, but might have. Wittgenstein once spoke of tearing someone's argument to shreds. The person didn't give in. His position held too much charm for him. But Wittgenstein had done his job. The job of philosophy is to establish the reality, incontrovertibly, exercising the internal criterion of an incontestable rigor. Standards of rigor may lengthen, and fair contentions eventually fall. What matters is what stands. Only what stands against all possible force can answer our needs. Only the irresistible solves the world. Okay.
thank you very much.